Welcome to our deep dive today. We're going to be exploring the emotional landscape of grief. We'll be using the booklet When Someone You Love Dies as our compass. You know, this is a subject that touches us all at some point. And while it can feel incredibly personal, maybe even a bit raw to dive into, I think there's a lot we can learn from each other's experiences.
I think you're right. There's this common misconception that grief follows a predictable path. But the reality is it's often a winding road, full of unexpected twists and turns.
Exactly, and this booklet really dives into that, doesn't it? It talks about how the initial shock after a loss can feel almost like a physical blow. You know that feeling of numbness, like you're moving through a fog? The booklet calls this psychological shock. It's kind of a fascinating concept.
It is. Think of it this way. It's almost like your mind's way of hitting the pause button. It's as if a wave is about to crash over you, and your system just shuts down temporarily to protect itself from being completely overwhelmed.
Like an emotional circuit breaker. I can see that. The booklet gives this example of Marianne, who lost her husband to cancer. She talks about how even a year later, she sometimes still feels like he's going to walk through the door.
That's incredibly common. And there's actually a psychological basis for this kind of prolonged denial. Attachment theory suggests that when we lose someone we're deeply connected to, our brains struggle to accept that the bond is truly broken. It's like a phantom limb sensation. You know it's gone, but you still feel its presence.
Wow, that's a really powerful analogy. So it's not just about wanting to believe they're still there. It's almost like our brains haven't fully caught up to the reality of the loss. And you know, this idea of denial, it's not just about thinking the person is still alive, is it? The booklet gives examples of people setting an extra place at the dinner table, buying their loved one's favorite foods at the grocery store.
Exactly. It's about holding on to those familiar routines, those little rituals that connected you to that person. It's a way of keeping their memory alive, even if it's just in these small everyday ways.
And sometimes I imagine those actions can almost feel involuntary, like you're not even consciously choosing to do them. You're just drawn to them out of habit.
Absolutely. And those habits, they're a testament to the depth of the bond you shared. It's like a muscle memory for the heart.
So it sounds like both shock and denial in their own ways are coping mechanisms that help us process this enormous event. But the booklet also talks about how, as the initial shock starts to wear off, other emotions often surface.
Right. And this is where things can get a little more complex. As that initial numbness fades, we start to feel the rawness of the loss more acutely. And one of the most common and perhaps unexpected emotions that emerges is anger.
Anger. I wouldn't necessarily have linked those two, but now that you mention it, it does make sense.
It does when you think about the nature of loss. It's often sudden, it's often out of our control, and it leaves us feeling powerless. And when we feel powerless, it's natural to lash out.
The booklet even mentions how this anger can be directed in all sorts of directions, right? Like at the healthcare professionals, if there's a feeling that they could have done more.
Yes, or at friends and family, who, while well-meaning, might say or do things that feel insensitive or dismissive of your pain, and sometimes even anger directed at the person who's gone for leaving you behind, for the burdens they might have left you with.
That's a really tough one to admit to, isn't it? I mean, how can you be angry at someone who's no longer here? But the booklet shares Corinne's story, and she talks about how even though she knows it wasn't her husband's choice to die, she still finds herself feeling resentful sometimes for the added responsibilities she now has to shoulder.
And that just speaks to the rawness and honesty of her grief. You see, anger in the face of death isn't about being logical or fair. It's a primal reaction to a wound that's still very fresh.
And alongside anger often comes guilt, right? Those what if and if only thoughts that can just consume you.
Yes. And guilt is often fueled by this desire for control. In a situation where we ultimately had none, we torture ourselves thinking we could have done things differently, that maybe we could have changed the outcome. The booklet gives the example of feeling guilty for not seeking medical help sooner, for not being a better spouse or child or parent.
And I imagine those feelings can be especially intense when it comes to the loss of a child.
You're right. The death of a child is often described as the most profound type of grief because it violates the natural order of things. We expect to outlive our children, and when that doesn't happen, it can shatter our worldview.
The booklet talks about how losing a child often leads to a more complicated grieving process with these added layers of guilt and despair, but it also stresses that there's no right way to grieve this kind of loss, or any loss for that matter.
Exactly. Grief is such a personal experience. There's no universal timeline. And there's no one-size-fits-all approach to healing. And that's something we often forget, don't we? We get caught up in the emotional turmoil and forget that grief also has a very practical side to it.
You're right. There are those day-to-day things that suddenly need to be dealt with. Finances, legal matters, all the responsibilities that the person who's gone used to handle.
It's like you're grieving this profound loss. And at the same time, you're being thrown into this whirlwind of new challenges.
I remember Marianne from the booklet mentioning how overwhelming it felt to have to sort through her late husband's affairs. She said it was like having to learn a whole new language on top of dealing with the emotional pain.
And I imagine that can feel incredibly isolating. Like everyone else expects you to be focusing on your emotions, but you're also drowning in paperwork and logistical nightmares.
Exactly. It's almost like there are these two separate worlds colliding, the internal world of grief and the external world of practicalities.
And navigating that collision can be incredibly difficult. It's why practical support can be just as valuable as emotional support during times of loss.
You mean like offering to help with errands, meals, childcare, that kind of thing?
Exactly. Sometimes the most helpful thing you can do for someone who's grieving is to take some of those practical burdens off their shoulders.
It's about showing up for them in tangible ways. And, you know, it makes me think about something else the booklet touches on, the idea that there's no set timeline for grief.
That's such a crucial point. We live in a society that's obsessed with timelines, with putting deadlines on healing, but grief just doesn't work that way.
It's like we expect people to get over it by a certain point, as if there's some magical switch that flips and everything goes back to normal.
And I think that expectation can actually do more harm than good. It puts pressure on people to suppress their grief, to rush through the process, when what they really need is time and space to heal at their own pace.
So how do we challenge those societal expectations? How do we create a space where people feel comfortable, grieving openly and honestly, without feeling rushed or judged?
It starts with recognizing that grief is not a linear process. There will be good days and bad days, moments of progress, and moments of regression. And that's okay. It's all part of the journey.
The booklet even talks about how comparing your grief to someone else's can be detrimental. What might seem like a delay to one person could be perfectly normal for another.
Absolutely. We all process loss in different ways, and we need to honor those individual differences. What matters most is that we allow ourselves to feel what we feel without judgment or comparison.
And to remember that it's okay to ask for help when we need it.
Exactly. There's strength in vulnerability, in acknowledging that we don't have to go through this alone.
And sometimes that help can come from unexpected places, like this booklet, for example. Even though it's just a small booklet, it offers so much validation and comfort, just by acknowledging the complexity of grief.
It normalizes those messy, difficult emotions. It lets you know that what you're feeling, however painful or confusing it might be, is a natural part of the healing process.
It's like having a companion on this journey, someone who understands the ups and downs, the twists and turns, and who reminds you that you're not going crazy.
And that you're not alone. One of the most powerful things about this booklet, I think, is its emphasis on shared human experience. Yes, our individual grief journeys are unique, but at the core, we're all navigating the same fundamental loss, the loss of someone we love.
And that shared experience, that common thread of grief, can be a source of connection, can it?
Absolutely. It can remind us that even in our darkest moments, we're part of something larger than ourselves. We're part of this human tapestry of love and loss.
You know, as we've been talking about all of this, what's really struck me is how the booklet manages to find this balance between acknowledging the pain of grief and also offering this sense of hope.
I think that's because it doesn't shy away from the difficult truths. It acknowledges the messy, the raw, the unexpected aspects of grief. But it also reminds us that healing is possible, that even though loss leaves a permanent mark, it doesn't have to define us.
It's like this booklet is saying, hey, it's okay to not be okay. And that's such a powerful message, especially in a culture that often pushes us to move on quickly.
It is powerful. And I think what makes it even more effective is that it's coming from a place of understanding, not judgment. The booklet doesn't try to offer easy solutions or quick fixes. It simply acknowledges the reality of grief with all its complexities and contradictions.
And by doing so, I think it opens up a space for genuine healing to occur.
Exactly. That allows us to let go of those expectations about how we should be grieving and to embrace our own unique experience, however messy or unpredictable it might be.
So as we're nearing the end of our deep dive, What do you think is the most important takeaway for our listener today if they're grappling with grief? What's the one piece of advice we want them to hold on to?
I think the most important message is this: you are not alone. Grief can feel incredibly isolating, but the reality is, it's a universal human experience. And even though our individual journeys are unique, that shared experience of loss can be a source of profound connection and comfort.
That's a beautiful thought. And it makes me think about something else the booklet mentions. The idea that as we move through our own grief, we might find ourselves in a position to offer support to others who are hurting, to listen with empathy, to share our own experiences, to simply be present with someone in their pain.
It's almost like grief becomes this unexpected bridge,
Yeah.
connecting us to others who have walked a similar path. And in that connection, we find a sense of shared humanity, of resilience, of hope.
What a powerful way to reframe the experience of loss, not just as something we endure, but as something that can ultimately transform us, connect us, and even empower us to help others.
Exactly. Grief can be a catalyst for growth, for compassion, for a deeper appreciation, for the preciousness of life.
Well, this has been an incredibly insightful deep dive. We've covered so much ground today, exploring the emotional roller coaster of grief, the unexpected turns, the messy truths that are often hidden beneath the surface.
But amidst all that, there's also this thread of resilience, of hope, of the enduring power of the human spirit to heal and to find meaning, even in the face of profound loss.
And I think that's the message we want to leave our listener with today. You are stronger than you think. There is hope, even in the darkest of times. And you don't have to walk this path alone. Resources like When Someone You Love Dies can offer guidance and support along the way, reminding you that healing is possible, connection is essential, and that even though loss leaves a permanent mark, it doesn't have to define you.
Beautifully said. And as we wrap up, I encourage our listener to take some time to reflect on what resonated with them most from our deep dive today. Maybe it was a particular story, a specific emotion, or simply the validation that their grief is valid, however it manifests. And remember, if you're finding this topic particularly resonant, explore When Someone You Love Dies further. It might offer solace and insights as you navigate your own path of healing. Thanks for joining us.